Settle down, brother. This is the Quarter Report powered by ENCA.com. South Africa is a movie. Welcome to the watch party. There was a time where some days in South Africa didn't even have one bombshell. I miss those times. We have 8 more bombshells today, just as big as the 7 from yesterday, because General Mkhwanazi spoke until midnight last night at the Ad Hoc Committee in Parliament investigating this whole mess of police corruption and political interference. And we have 8 crucial bombshells to cover today on this episode of the Quarter Report. It's going to be a lot. And I'm going to tell you all 8 of them right now. 1, Jacob Zuma, while president, did nothing about General Mkhwanazi's complaints about political interference into policing when Mkhwanazi told him. 2, that there's evidence of Bheki Cele sending Matlala bank account details for a private bank account that was not his, and then Matlala sending a proof of payment to that bank account back to Bheki Cele. 3, they are currently going through Senzo Mchunu payment records. 4, the DA's Glynnis Breytenbach must account for how she was complicit in the charges against now convicted criminal and former SAPS high-up Richard Mdluli being dropped. 5, the KZN July unrest in 2021 was partially to do with military failings. 6, the police service is compromised by politics, and Mkhwanazi described how that happened. 7, some journalists are being handled by propagandists and should be investigated, but other journalists are doing good work. And 8, the police committee fundamentally failed him. All of those are bombshells. We're going to work through all of those as this show unfolds. The only place to watch the full show is at the link in the description. If you're watching on YouTube, it's on enca.com. I would also encourage you to like and subscribe to the channel if you're on YouTube right now. As always, www.3beaniesnetwork.com is the place where you go and get some merchandise. Let's get into these 8 bombshells. They're all bombs, and I'm shell-shocked. Let's start with number 1, which for me is a really massive bombshell. You would have heard by now that General Mkhwanazi was acting police commissioner back in 2011-12 time when Nathi Mthethwa was police minister under Jacob Zuma's first administration. There's been a lot of back and forth fighting about whether or not Zuma was Team Mkhwanazi or whether Zuma moved to neutralize Mkhwanazi and ignore his complaints and his work. The MK party has been talking a lot about that. The MK party, after Mkhwanazi's press conference in July, tried to claim him as their great hero and one of their own. The MK party has also tried to stop the Matlala Commission from happening at all in court and failed in their attempt to do so, which I'm sure you're thinking is quite odd. Why would they not want investigations into these claims to happen? Well, Mkhwanazi, as we've reported on in previous shows, has already spoken about how Nathi Mthethwa did to Mkhwanazi what Mkhwanazi said is the most clear and dramatic and significant example of political interference into police affairs that he's ever experienced back in 2012 when Nathi Mthethwa called him to Nathi Mthethwa's house and basically told him, you're going to stop doing what you're doing. And then General Mkhwanazi managed to get an audience with Jacob Zuma himself, president at the time, and relayed all of these complaints and concerns that he had. And Zuma, according to Mkhwanazi yesterday, said, I hear all your concerns. I'm soon going to make changes in certain key positions in key portfolios. And then General Mkhwanazi, after he was National Police Commissioner, was just kind of left out to pasture, he said. He was left at home for months and months, getting what he said was a full paid salary and just sitting around not being redeployed. And he said that it was hyper regrettable that Jacob Zuma did nothing largely about his complaints that he could see, the complaints that he registered. I don't know if there's direct evidence of Jacob Zuma saying, leave that guy out to pasture, neutralize him, disempower him, and just leave him to rot without any kind of deployment in SAPS for a while, even as we pay him to just sit on his couch at home. That is what happened under Jacob Zuma's administration's police department with Jacob Zuma's police minister. That, unfortunately for the MK revisionists and for the Zuma sympathizers, is damning. But that is the first really important thing to talk about. The second really important thing to talk about. Remember that yesterday we spoke about the fact that Mkhwanazi said that it doesn't matter if Bheki Cele called him a good cop. If Bheki Cele has done something wrong, Mkhwanazi will deal with him and arrest him. Well, General Mkhwanazi, under questioning from MPs, talked about a bunch of evidence that they had and a bunch of documents that they'd submitted to various portfolios showing links that are worth investigating for potential criminality between different people in this whole firestorm. And General Mkhwanazi spoke about Bheki Cele, former police minister under Ramaphosa's administration sent the bank details of a private bank account that was not his bank account to Vusimusi Kat Matlala. And then later, Kat Matlala made a payment into that private bank account, and we know that because Kat Matlala sent Bheki Cele the proof of payment into that bank account. Why would he do that? Why would he make a payment to a bank account on the instructions of former Police Minister Bheki Cele? That's not Bheki Cele's bank account. And then send Bheki Cele proof of the payment into that bank account. And what General Mkhwanazi was speaking about there was the fact that they need to investigate this because this could be a situation where payments are being made through bank accounts of private citizens or front companies, shell companies, as we've seen with Tembisa, hospital scandal, and a bunch of other corruption, where monies are paid through a variety of private bank accounts that eventually ends up in the coffers of the powerful person, like hypothetically in this case Bheki Cele, to cover up the trail and to confuse investigators about where the money was running to, when actually the whole time the money was just running through all of these shell companies or these private bank accounts from the person paying the money to the very powerful person at the end who didn't want anybody to find out. Very, very, very important. 3, General Mkhwanazi and his investigators are now going through the records of payments to a variety of different financial organizations that represent current police minister on suspension, Senzo Mchunu, interests. And the quote that everybody's running with this morning is that they're going to scrap and dig until they find gold, going through particularly a trust fund account because linked to Senzo Mchunu, because Mkhwanazi says that although they currently don't have hard evidence of corruption, of the police minister committing corruption or being involved in corruption, they believe that they really might find it based on all of the other evidence of all the other connections of Senzo Mchunu being connected to Brown Mkhwanazi and Kat Matlala, amongst others. So they are working on that right now. And I think what's really important about this moment, when Mkhwanazi said, we don't have evidence of this corruption yet as much as we think we will find some based on the other evidence and what it indicates. I think what's really important about this is that it shows that when Mkhwanazi says he has evidence, he probably does. Because he's saying in this case that he doesn't have evidence of this, but when he speaks at another point, spoke at another point yesterday about having evidence against certain journalists, certain magistrates, certain politicians, he probably does have that evidence if he's willing to admit that he doesn't have evidence of other major things. And let's go to number 4. So the fourth big bombshell, we've spoken about Richard Mdluli. We've spoken about how he was protected, according to Mkhwanazi, through political interference, how that connects to a variety of different people, including Nathi Mthethwa and Jacob Zuma's administration as president, and how charges against Richard Mdluli were dropped years ago. And then eventually he was convicted of a raft of things, including assault, intention to assault, kidnapping, and all that. We spoke about this yesterday. And now Richard Mdluli is this year on trial for further corruption charges. General Mkhwanazi pointed out that the DA's Glynnis Breytenbach was involved in the decision, had power over the decision to drop charges against Richard Mdluli. And this is another moment where Mkhwanazi is not just pointing out ANC leaders who are rotten, but other people who he thinks are allegedly part of the rot. We know about Diane Kohler-Barnard. We spoke about her yesterday. We've spoken about Fadil Adams, amongst others. This is another case of an extremely, well, probably the most high-profile DA politician so far being called out for being part of the mess by Mkhwanazi and saying that she needs to come and explain herself. So he's really saying that he is seeing wrongdoing literally everywhere. That's point 4. Point 5, the KZN July unrest in 2021, General Mkhwanazi was very upset about that. He said part of the reason why the army was not able to scramble to deal with rioters and inciters of violence was because they didn't have tents and diesel. There wasn't a diesel contract. So the army couldn't even drive their diesel-based vehicles out into KZN to deal with the riots that were happening. General Mkhwanazi also said that he was upset with a bunch of ANC high-end politicians at the time who criticized him, and also he said just lied about the unrest. And he specifically called out Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula, recently disgraced and fallen ANC leader on significant corruption charges, for essentially criticizing him for being unavailable to do his work at that time, where he said that actually he was with his wife to attend the birth of his child. And so there's that. So yeah, he really, really, really took the gloves off against everybody. He also said some other stuff, like he would have shut down the internet during July 2021 to like curb influences saying like go and cause more violence, which is controversial. We might talk about that a little bit later once we've got through all of the 8. Okay, then let's go to point 6, SAPS compromised by politics. This was super interesting. So General Mkhwanazi, I think this was in direct response to Julius Malema's questions. He was talking about how SAPS has been compromised because right back in the 2000s, ANC leaders would start trying to recruit police service officers into politics, tried to get them to jump across and start to work in the ANC and for the ANC. And he also obviously spoke about the fact that there were plenty of cater deployments of ANC people being put into high-ranking positions within SAPS. And he said that what all of that did was immediately started a cultural change within SAPS, people calling each other comrade. It started to seem like people had different vested interests. He spoke about like people trying to undermine each other within SAPS and how that got politicized. He spoke about the fact that when Jacob Zuma, before he dethroned Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma was in disgrace, how people who were working on Jacob Zuma's protection unit, according to Mkhwanazi, suddenly started getting treated very badly at work and started getting like cold-shouldered by elites in SAPS in Pretoria, and how there were these little underminings that were happening all the time. He also described how at one of the ANC conferences, I think it was in 2007, SAPS people attended the conference, but not to do their jobs, but to be part of celebration parties, and they had drinks, and they had a celebration area and maybe a party tent, something like that. All of that to say that Mkhwanazi said that this is how the rot of politicizing SAPS happened, is that more and more often people within SAPS were offered tantalizing opportunities to get involved in politics and make money as entrepreneurs. And all of that meant that there were now other interests within SAPS, and there were people within SAPS who were available or vulnerable to the influence of political parties and politicians because people who they worked with had now jumped sides into the political spectrum and still had their numbers and still knew how they worked and where they worked and stuff. But also because they knew that there was incentive to work for particular political interests if you wanted to get further within SAPS. So that's point 6. Point 7. And this is where it gets really bombshelly in another way. The 7th bombshell is that he said that some journalists are being handled by propagandists who have agendas to destroy the reputations of certain people who are their enemies, including people like General Mkhwanazi. And he specifically called out Abraham Mashego, who's a reporter for City Press, now owned by News 24, saying that Mkhwanazi believes that Abraham Mashego was specifically targeting him and going after him, sent him some direct messages and that Abraham Mashego should be investigated. And then he in the same breath said that it was weird or a pity or unfortunate because Abraham Mashego working for News 24 as a media house is weird because at the same time he said so many news journalists at News 24 are very good and have been doing very good work and like very, very good investigative journalism to expose many rots happening in the country. And this is where I speak to the people who've made their money off of the grift of conspiracy theories against big media houses, basically using and profiting off of media houses' work and journalism's work, while at the same time saying that they're all captured, they're all working for something evil, and specifically going after certain journalists and try to destroy their reputations on no evidence, just hypothetical imagination, chew on a pencil speak. Because those same conspiracy theorists have also taken every single word that General Mkhwanazi has said as the gospel, the truth. And now General Mkhwanazi's made it awkward for you guys, hasn't he? Because which one is it? Because I thought all big media houses were captured and really, 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 really bad. And Mkhwanazi, everything that he says is true. And now Mkhwanazi has said that one of the biggest media houses in the country is full of phenomenal journalists doing phenomenal investigative reporting. Which one are you going to pick, bro? How are you going to dribble your way out of this one without falling over? I can't wait to see it. But the next thing that Mkhwanazi said was something that has made many journalists alarmed, which is he said the State Security Agency should investigate some of these journalists. And he kind of walked it back a little bit later. But that is something we need to be very careful of, because as much as we need to have processes to make sure that journalists are held to a high standard of accountability, are telling the truth, are providing reliable reporting based on good evidence, you know what we also need? We really need for the State Security Agency, the secret services, to not be going after the people who work in truth and reliable fact reporting. Because if that happens, you are spinning right down the road into authoritarianism, where journalists are stopped by the state security agency, the government's spooks from reporting on the truth. That is a really, really dangerous, slippery slope to go down. And then the last bombshell is he explicitly said that the Committee on Policing earlier this year failed him, because he said, and a lot of those police committee members are on this panel, on the Ad Hoc Committee, he said, the allegations, the concerns that I raised, the claims that I made should have set alarm bells ringing when I spoke to you guys in that meeting earlier this year, in that committee meeting. It should have made you worry. And he said any reasonable person on that committee, having heard a provincial police commissioner and former acting police commissioner saying what I said, should have and would have acted on that stuff to investigate it. And the fact that you didn't is a total failing. And it's awkward because he was talking to Ian Cameron, the DA's chair of that police committee meeting. But he said that that was a fundamental failing that has led us to where we are now. All 8 done. Now I'm going to let James talk for a while.
I just want to highlight 2 things, but they sort of bleed into one another. And it comes back to your idea that you often talk about is you kind of, if you give someone enough time, they will eventually reveal to you who they are. And I think Mkhwanazi is an example of that, because South Africa has been looking for a strong man for a very long time. And I think they've found it in Mkhwanazi, because before all of this police capture stuff started happening, since that press conference that he did, he had this reputation of being no nonsense, shoot first, ask questions later. And I feel like we are seeing that now come up again, where he believes if he sees someone as doing something wrong, they should face sort of vengeance for that. And that's why I believe he's calling state security apparatus against journalists.
That also fits everything he said about his come up, because he was talking with Malema about how he grew up in this township and he saw IFP and ANC members fighting and killing each other. And then he saw ANC members celebrating a victory and IFP members coming and killing them. And he basically decided, he was explicit about this. He said, I wanted to be in the on-the-ground crime fighting unit, not a detective, not a court like administrator or something. I wanted to be in the trenches doing the work, stopping these criminals.
And it's clearly made him a very effective police officer. And he's risen through the ranks with a lot of praise from a lot of his fellow SAPS members. However, we live in a democracy, and we need to have checks and balances on everyone in positions of power. And I think this is an example of, we need an Mkhwanazi, we need someone who's hardcore, by the book, all of this kind of stuff, but we also need oversight. And that is what builds good societies. And yeah, I think that him calling against journalists, and I think people coming back and saying, listen, you can't really do that, because that's where we start straying towards dictatorial ideas. And this leads on to my second point, which is that I think it's disingenuous of Mkhwanazi to say that it's almost, I feel like he was implying that journalists just sort of say anything and there's no oversight, which is not true. We have SANEF, we have the Press Council, and we have the BCCSA.
We also have these media companies who stake their daily reputations on being right, on having evidence that what they said is true. So there's a self-correcting mechanism within journalism, because if you are exposed to have been talking nonsense, remember how IOL dipped after the Tembisa 10, you're in trouble.
Totally. And that's not to say, and this is where I think people oversimplify this conversation. On the conspiracy theory left and on the alt-right, there are people who will point to 1 or 2 articles and say, oh, but you messed up this thing and accused this person of this thing. For which News 24, Daily Maverick, Mobungane, Ground Up, all of these media houses have then, when they mess up, apologized for, corrected the mistake, etc., etc., etc. You can't define an entire industry and throw it all out because of mistakes that they have repented for. So coming out and saying, oh, all media is captured, you can't trust anyone but me, the podcast bro, who has formed their opinion on reading the articles of these journalists, who then decide that the entire industry needs to be cleared away.
And here's the key thing about those conspiracy theorist content creators, right? Is what they're trying to do is destabilize your opinion of reputable, reliable reporting so that you have to come to them to find out the truth. They are selling themselves, who are not primary source journalists, as the ones who can spot the good journalism from the bad, and they are the ones who know the truth. So the strategy of people who basically say all media mainstream is captured, none of it is good, and at the flip of a switch based on their narrative and their agenda, this person is bad or this person is good. The strategy is to make themselves the arbiter of truth and nobody else, because that is good for their audience building. It's a strategy to make them to make you, the potential audience, come to them and only listen to their opinion, which is good for their prestige, their follow counts, their audience, their clicks, and ultimately their bank balances. And this, by the way, is a strategy that is used all around the world, has been used all around the world, and you should always question it. You should because to be clear again, sometimes journalists are bought, sometimes media houses have got ill intent. IOL pretended that Tabisa 10 actually happened, right? But all around the world, you see these grifters who are basically saying, don't believe the people who have made careers out of finding out the truth and telling you. You should always question them.